For this hopefully informative and interesting forum on the impact of charter schools and school closings on public education and what we can do about it. Today's panel is sponsored by the Grassroots Education Movement, GEM, and CAPE, which is Concerned Advocates for Public Education. And we're going to share firsthand information today regarding the unfair and unwanted co-locations of charter schools in our public school buildings. The panel members will present the truth about what charter schools represent and why the school closings open the door to privatization. After a question and answer session and discussion, you will walk away with a parting gift, and a very powerful parting gift. We're going to provide you with a toolkit that it's full of resources and information, and we hope guide and inspire you to how you can join in the fight to defend public education.
Right. Okay, Michael Fiorillo is the chapter leader at Newcomers High School in Queens, where he's taught for 13 years as an ESL teacher and also as an English teacher. Before teaching, he was an organizer and a business rep for Local 802 of the Musicians, the American Federation of Musicians in New York City. He is also a member of ICE and is running on the ICE TJC slate for high school executive board in the current UFT elections.
And thank you for being here, everybody. I'm just going to open up the discussion with sort of a broad overview of how we got to where we are today with public education and charter schools in general. I think it's impossible for us to really look at the issue and the issues facing public education and their relation to charter schools without seeing it in terms of what really is a multi-decade crisis in public education, which goes back really at least to the 1950s. You can even see evidence of this in pop culture and mass culture of the time. In the early 60s, late 50s and early 60s, you had a spate, and going into the mid-60s, you had spates of films about crises occurring in the public schools. You had the novel Up the Down Staircase, which was later made into a film with Stanley Dennis. You had although set in England, you had the Sidney Poitier vehicle, To Serve With Love. All of these films used the crisis in the schools as a backdrop, as well as the struggles faced by teachers and students in the public schools. And that was the backdrop for these films. And so we could obviously go further back, but time doesn't permit. So we're really talking about a multi-decade issue and a crisis that's been decades in the making. And so going back to the 1950s, what were the drivers, what were the engines of this crisis? You start seeing in the 1950s, you see the emergence of white flight from the cities, which is being sped up and energized by various federal subsidies that did very, very great harm to the cities. You had the construction of the federal interstate highway system, which sped up the movement of whites from the cities. Many of these highways were actually bulldozed right through communities, which caused massive displacement within those communities. So simultaneously, you had displacement of urban communities, which was also speeding up the flight of people from these places. At the same time, you have federal policies that subsidize home ownership at the expense of renters, which put strain on the finances of cities. You had urban renewal that was also displacing communities, urban communities. You had the emergence, as going along with that hand in hand and as a kind of feedback, negative feedback loop, you then had a process of deindustrialization from the cities, followed by redlining of investment and disinvestment, so that banks and insurance companies were actually stopping investment to these communities at precisely the time that these communities were deindustrializing. I mean, the borough that we are in right now is a classic example. This was the most industrialized county in the United States. Brooklyn had more factory jobs in 1960 than Detroit and Pittsburgh combined. which sounds more impressive than it is because not all auto production was in the city of Detroit and not all steel production was in the city of Pittsburgh. Nevertheless, that gives you a sense of it. It was the fact that with the closing of the Navy Yard and with the, the Navy Yard closing in the 1960s being kind of a very significant milestone, the loss of factories along the waterfront, the decline of the port, and so forth. The deindustrialization of the city, and Brooklyn foremost, goes along with the economic crisis that the city then started facing toward the end of the 1960s and the early 1970s. So you sort of have the convergence of all of these forces. You have disinvestment and deindustrialization. You have the flight of the middle class from the city, all converging in the 1970s with a fiscal crisis where the city essentially went bankrupt. It came very, very close to going bankrupt. So there's a lot of discussions and a lot of argument about what happened back then. Some people on the left often describe the bankruptcy of New York City really as a banker's coup. In 1975, or we could also call it a strike by capital. We usually think of labor as going on strike, but capital can go on strike as well. And all throughout the 60s and 1970s in the urban areas of New York City, in the urban areas of the US, capital essentially went on strike by denying investment, limiting investment in urban areas, and then reaching a peak in 1975. Capital literally went on strike by threatening to stop buying New York City bonds. In other words, to stop financing the funding of the city. And in order to continue buying New York City bonds, essentially New York City gave up its own sovereignty. And the day-to-day running of the city was taken up by an emergency financial control board, which was dominated by the banks and by the insurance companies. And going along with that were immense cutbacks that resulted in the closings of hospitals, in the closings of schools, and here's where it leads back to the educational system. So in 1975, 15,000 teachers were laid off from the public school system. Virtually art and music were virtually entirely eliminated from the public school system. Guidance was virtually eliminated. By the way, at the same time they were laying off 15,000 teachers, not a single administrator was laid off. Parenthetical. So we reach a point in the mid to late 70s where we've been going through, and of course this is to say nothing about the struggles over community control, the intense political polarization that existed in urban, particularly in New York, and particularly in central Brooklyn, regarding issues of community control. So these economic issues are kind of taking place at the same time that you have intense political polarization as well, which is one of the things that allowed a lot of these cutbacks to take place, because there was such splits among the communities that they were not able to unite and fight these cutbacks that were essentially really attacks on the living standards of people in New York City. So by the time the mid to late 70s comes around, we have a public school system that has essentially been disinvested in, has been denied resources for decades, and is in a condition of very, very serious crisis. And following upon that, starting in the early 80s, now what happens with the emergence of this emergency financial control board is we essentially have the emergence and the outlines of the economic system that we're seeing today, which generally goes by the name of neoliberalism. And it's the bankruptcy of New York City in 1975 that is the opening act in the campaign for neoliberalism, the privatization of public space, the diminution of the public sector, the attack on living standards of working class people, and the shifting of power away from local democratically elected entities to private entities. So it started, that bell rings in 1975, essentially.